I've been asked to talk about the climate crisis in Africa and the role that Africa is playing in all that crisis. Basically, we're going to be talking about energy transition and China's position in Africa in that regard. So in the first part, we're going to be sharing the basic information we already know about China, about climate change in Africa, and later on, we're going to go working on. We're going to be looking at what China is doing in Africa in terms of climate change and energy transition. So in terms of global gas greenhouse emission, we know that Africa is the less polluter of all entities in the world, despite being 1.3 billion population, still has contributed much less than the United States, Japan, China, and European Union in terms of pollution. So Africa has a great need of energy, but also as in terms of producing CO2 emissions, the less polluter among all the actors in the world. In terms of climate change, we know that, as I said before, Africa is disproportionately experiencing the negative effect of climate change in Africa, including water stress. We've been seeing flood in East Africa. The last 2 years, we've been seeing that. We see reduced food production. We see increasingly frequency of extreme weather in different parts of the continent. But we also see how climate change amplifies instability in Africa. The data, the research made by Africa Center of Strategic Studies have shown how much this have impacted in terms of political instability, in terms of piracy in the west coast of Africa. We've also seen that Africa is the world, as I say, Africa is the world lowest level of per capita use of modern energy. That really impacts Africa in terms of economic development, industrialization process. There is that need of having much more energy, but also there is that need of Africa kind of reassessing its position, and although it's a less polluter of all, but growing to that transition to energy transition to be much more effective, to have more sustainable energy features in this program. In terms of impact, we've seen that, as I mentioned before, we've seen the recent flood in East Africa, the impact that it had in different part of in East Africa, in different countries, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya. We also see the effect of climate change on Africa. We see the fish scares in West Africa, the weather trade mills, the Sahel has been 25% decrease in terms of rainfall. We've seen all over the continent various cases of impact of climate change on the continent, and the continent is one of the most affected by climate change, always the least polluter among all the nations in the world, among different actors in the world. The climate change also amplifies instability in Africa. I said before, in Sahel, in Gulf of Guinea, in Sudan, we see human displacement, in forests in Congo Basin, in Central Africa. The Congo Basin forest has been decreasing. We've seen many companies being involved in logging in the region. And in Mozambique also, we also see that case where we see now instability in the east part of Mozambique happening because of climate change, how it impacted the region. In terms of energy crisis, we know that Africa has a huge potential in terms of different sources of energy. We have wind, nuclear, thermal, geothermal, and solar thermal hydraulic potential. We have many countries as the DRC having a lot of water capacity, being able to have hydroelectrical power. We also have nuclear capacity in South Africa. In Southern Africa, we have geothermal capacity in the east part of Africa. We also have thermal capacity in other part. We also have solar capacity in the northern part of Africa. There is so much potential that needs to be tapped in, where we need a lot of investment and presence, where Africa can really gain into in terms of renewable energy presence and investment. In terms of Africa energy crisis, what do we know? What's the fact that we know? We know that we have 600 million people without access to electricity. We also have population income growing. The demand for modern energy is expanding. By 2030, we're going to see that that demand growing fast. We also see that there's a demand in terms of energy in the industry. By that demand is going to increase by 40% by 2030. Africa is also the home of 60% of best solar resource globally, yet only 1% install or solar PV capacity on the continent. I'm going to go down there later on. I'm going to be explaining what's happening in that sector. Africa has almost unlimited potential of solar capacity, abundant hydro, wind, and geothermal energy sources. Renewable, including solar, wind power, and geothermal, account for 80% of new power generation capacity to 2030. And we see that potential being really groomed by Africa, and we see a lot of investment coming in, but not as much as we would expected to see that happening. In terms of production of oil and gas, it still remain one of very essential to Africa economic and social development. Although we see a lot of withdrawal in terms of in that area, but we know that Africa has a lot of potential in terms of oil and gas. Gas, we're gonna see what's up. We're gonna see the gas potential that we see in Mozambique. We see also the oil capacity that we see in Nigeria, in Angola. They're also essential parts of African economic development. And when we see the war in Ukraine, and we see how Europe is trying to diversify its source of oil and gas, we see that there is still a potential for Africa there. And this is where the conundrum comes from many African countries, where even for Africa itself, in terms of the place of oil and gas in that development. The energy crisis across the continent hinders Africa economic development. And the data shows that there is a 2 to 4% of GDP annually are impacted because of the lack of proper energy on the continent. But Africa has also a lot of potential, because Africa accounts for 40% of global reserve of cobalt, manganese, and platinum, key minerals for batteries and hydrogen technology. Those are key elements in energy transition, and this is where Africa has a card to play. There is a huge potential that Africa has to foster in that regard. In terms of renewable potential, I already showed that before. I should already show that ahead. So what do we have in terms of China and Africa in terms of climate change cooperation? We know that both China and Africa, they have put in place the China-Africa Environmental Cooperation Center based in Nairobi. The center is supposed to be a forum for environmental policy interaction, clearing house for information exchange, a platform for capacity development support, a catalyst for joint environmental program and project, and platform for mobilization of funds for environmental projects that will contribute toward Africa development priorities. In terms of the second element, it's what we had during the last FOCAC in last November, the 8th FOCAC, the declaration, the China-Africa Partnership on Strategic Cooperation on New Area for the fight against climate change. A lot of highlights have been given. Here you're gonna see the highlights of it, but due to time, I'm not gonna read it. I'm gonna be sharing the presentation, so you're gonna be seeing those highlights. But we see that, for example, China has declared has already launched 100 clean energy and green development project under the forum or under the FOCAC to support African countries better utilizing solar, hydropower, wind, and biogas. We see that China is also pulling out from new coal-fired power projects, and Matienzi already mentioned it. And we even see that because it's that China pulling out from that area has been shown, for example, in South Africa, where China is pulled away from the Limpopo free economic zone project they were building over there. But when it comes now to China in Africa in terms of mineral energy and clean energy transition, what do we know? We know that China has put something around 43 billion over in investing in energy in Africa. It has the single largest investment portfolio on the continent. And between 20 and 2010, China has invested a lot in hydropower projects on the continent. Hydropower projects are the major project where China is investing on on renewable energy. But beside the hydropower, we don't see a lot of Chinese presence in solar or wind, although we have big projects in Ethiopia, in South Africa, and now one project being built in Zambia. We know that China is expected to extend to be involved in nearly 70% of hydropower projects on the continent, and main contractor in renewable energy in main contractors in renewable project in Africa are state-owned companies that are backed by policy bank from China. And finally, we see also how China is moving away from financing core project, and it's been already mentioned before. So we have here various cases: the Adama wind farm in Ethiopia, the Garissa solar project in Kenya, and the Dar wind farm in South Africa, the wind farm in South Africa. So what are the challenges that we face in terms of renewable financing in Africa? We've noticed there's a relatively low funding and financing in renewable energy projects in Africa. Why? Because there is a lack of bankable projects. Most projects are hill-packed, are not well presented. So there is that problem for many financing body, being DFIs, being bilateral partners or strategic companies and financing companies and financing banks. And when you have institutions like Policy Bank from China, who are now more careful about big projects, you understand that the risk that those big projects present are quite high for those banks to come into funding those projects. We have regulatory and policy barrier that we've seen being across the continent, because for many African continents, energy is still a state-owned controlled sector. So many countries are opening up to private sectors still, where a lot of implementation needs to be made in terms of law, in terms of regulation. We have poorly structured and packaged projects that needs to be improved by government, and enabling environment. Enabling environment is one of the biggest problem and challenge that we see, because you have bad governance, you have corruption, you have lack of solid infrastructure. You can build a power project, but how are you going to connect it to the main grid? You have a transportation issue, distribution issue that needs to be addressed by many African countries. So in terms of now minor energy transition, this is where Africa has a tremendous card to play, because we see that the minerals that you're going to need for energy transition, we're going to have lithium, cobalt that are used in power, in electrical vehicle batteries, that's really needed today in terms of energy transition. We're going to have molybdenum, we're going to have chromium and aluminum, and Africa is home for many of those natural resources. We have countries like South Africa, DRC with cobalt, Zimbabwe with lithium. We have so many countries that have that opportunity today to raise to the challenge and become main partners in that energy transition. But we also see that China is very dominating in terms of processing, because China is processing most of those natural resources. Now the challenges for Africa is how to create a value chain on the continent. The solution can be through pooling resources to create a continental value chain through Africa Free Trade Agreement. We see that resources can be pulled from South Africa. You can see countries can share the energy crisis, can share the energy to create a value chain on some other country. We can see South African can help to process lithium and cobalt coming from DRC and Zimbabwe. There is a need to creating an enabling environment for local value chain. And China, as you see, as I said before, China is the major player in those countries, and China has a role also to play. This is where China is facing a new conundrum, because it sees that in DRC, in Zimbabwe, in Guinea, producing countries are asking to have a local value chain for them on their countries. This is now a challenge for China, how China needs to adapt in that new environment, and how African countries need to create environment for those Chinese investment to create those value chain in Africa. And I'm going to finish with some tips to understand how to better cover China and Africa in terms of energy transition. We need to understand Chinese global stance and position on climate change and energy transition, better understand China internal situation on climate change and impact and its own impact on China's engagement elsewhere, and in this case, specifically in Africa, understand China's economic change and evolution, understand Africa's energy needs, challenge, opportunities, and in the energy transition. And we also have to understand the geopolitics of energy transition, because there is a major geopolitics issue in that situation that we need to understand to grasp if we want to report more accurately on these issues, and China engagement in Africa, how it fits Africa's situation. We also need to understand the Chinese actors involved in the energy transition in Africa, which are the bank, the policy banks, the central government, and different entities that come into play, how they play the game in Africa, and how we need to engage with them, understanding China energy's financing and approaches, and of course dig into more academic research on the topic to have much more understanding of the situation. And here you have some useful resource that you can find, the database on Boston University, for Boston University on global energy finance, and different database that you can find Chinese details on China's being involved and how China is financing climate change and energy transition in Africa and elsewhere in the world. Thank you, and this is my part for today. I'm going to be waiting for Q&A to address some question that we may have.